Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us for the second of our 2022 midterm seminar series. And as a reminder, before we get started, we'll have two more each of the next 2 Wednesdays. For those of us who are coming to one of our events for the first time, just as a quick introduction, we're the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics, and our work sort of has 3 focuses. First is we produce innovative research on the evolving relationship between social media and politics. Second, we create open source tools and methods to support the work of academics and other researchers. And finally, we support the development of the field by training the next generation of scholars and hosting events like this one. So our goal here is to bring together leading scholars to present new and in-progress research on the intersection of social media, politics, and democracy. So let's jump right in. Today's conversation is going to focus on how candidates and lawmakers use social media to gain media attention, raise money, respond to crises, and shape the broader political conversation. Each of the great scholars who we're so lucky to have with us here today are going to have 10 minutes for presentation. I'll introduce each of them right before they go. And then we'll have a Q&A at the very end, roughly 20 minutes for that. Just as a reminder, the chat feature is turned off, so please use the Q&A feature, and I'll be moderating at the end. So to get started, our first presenter will be Maggie McDonald. Maggie is a postdoctoral fellow here at the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. Her research focuses on political communication in American politics, specifically elections. Her main area of interest is how political actors, such as politicians and their campaigns, strategically use new technologies like social media to achieve their goals, and what the effect, if any, of those behaviors are. She will present a working paper that the democratizing and polarizing impact of fundraising on Twitter. Maggie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Full screen. Okay, can everyone see my slides? Yes, okay, thank you for the thumbs up. Hi, everybody. As Eve said, my name is Maggie, and I am excited to share this project with you all. In this work, we focus on the impact of social media on campaign fundraising and propose 2 pathways through which campaigns are able to raise money with their tweets. The first is by communicating directly to users, and the second is an indirect pathway where a campaign's message is spread further than it otherwise would have been through media and journalists retweeting their tweets. Importantly, both of these pathways can and do go to people outside of the candidate's district who cannot vote for them. And there are several things that we know about congressional campaigns and their online strategies that shape this project. First, previous research of campaigns broadly have argued that social media offers a form of direct or unmediated communication where politicians have control over the context, content, and timing of their posts. This is in contrast to an indirect or mediated form of communication, which would be something like news coverage or a newspaper article where the media has more of a role in shaping the impact of a campaign's message. We also know that campaigns of all types use Twitter to spread their message to a range of audiences. And from interviews with presidential campaigns and staff and congressional campaigns and staff, the campaigns themselves perceive media and journalists to be one of their main audiences on Twitter. And so in this project, we examine the role of the media as an audience of campaigns and ask, do candidates benefit from their attention? And if so, which candidates benefit? Is this universally felt, or is this felt only for some campaigns? And when I say benefit here, I mean tangible goods like money. Campaigns need money. With money, they can pay for their staff, and they can also pay for things like television advertisements, things that help them to be successful. And in recent years, individual donors have been an increasingly important pool of money for campaigns. In the 2020 elections, over 60% of contributions received by incumbents of both parties came from individual donors. And from survey work, we know that individual donors, especially those from out of state, are strategic and ideological and give to candidates that they share preferences with. And so in this space, we theorize that the tweets, topics that are most likely to appeal to these national individuals that would also be considered interesting or newsworthy by the news media are those about nationally salient and polarizing topics and politicians. So here, think abortions, guns, Nancy Pelosi, Donald Trump. We propose specifically, first, testing this direct pathway, that on the days when campaigns receive more retweets on their tweets, they'll receive more donations. And second, considering this indirect pathway, on the days when campaigns tweet about nationally salient and polarizing topics and receive retweets from media accounts, they'll receive more donations than when they were not retweeted. Further, we argue that this will hold for campaigns in safe seats, but not competitive seats, and for incumbents and non-incumbents. To test these hypotheses, we bring together several sources of data. The first are all tweets by 2020 congressional candidates from January 1st until whenever they leave the race. This is about 1.4 million tweets from incumbents and non-incumbents. And we labeled all of these tweets for 20 nationally salient and polarizing figures and issues, which for the purposes of analysis, we collapsed down into 3 subtopics: Republican political leaders, Democratic political leaders, and issues. Then everything else is considered other, so not about nationally salient or polarizing things. We pair these tweets with individual contributions, daily level, to the campaigns, measures of district competitiveness, and then every time one of those 2020 candidates was retweeted by national media outlets or local media outlets. And these media tweets are drawn from a recurring collection maintained by CSMAP. Results for national journalists are in the appendix, but I won't present them today for time. Now, to test our first hypothesis, we consider this direct pathway and assess if campaigns receive more donations when they get more retweets. To do this, we estimate OLS regression models, where the dependent variable is a 2-day rolling sum of contributions. So the sum of contributions received on day T, whenever a tweet was made, and the day after. Our independent variable is the total retweets the candidate received from their day T tweets. And we control for things like party and district competitiveness. And we find that retweets are associated with more contributions. There's a positive, statistically significant, substantive relationship here. And I will say most of the results are happening on the left side of the plot. So the difference between 0 retweets and 1,000 retweets is $1,500. They hit $2,000 about the 30,000 retweet mark. And after that, it continues to increase, but much more gradually. To consider our second hypothesis, we assess if campaigns receive more donations when they are retweeted by the media. To do this, we estimate additional regressions separately for each media type. Here again, our dependent variable is the 2-day rolling sum of contributions. And our independent variable is now the number of times that a media organization retweeted a candidate on day T. We condition here on the number of retweets that candidate tweets had right before they were retweeted by the media, as well as tweet topic. We control for the same things as for our first analysis, but we also add in a control here for the number of retweets by other media types. Now, before I show you the results, there are many interaction terms in the model. The results are difficult to see in a presentation. So what I'm going to show you here is a table where every row is a media type topic pairing. And then the results are the effect of being retweeted by that media type compared to not being retweeted by that media type, holding fixed all other variables. And so what we see here is that overall, for all candidates considered together, there is generally a positive relationship in that when they are retweeted by the media, they get more money. This is strongest when the politicians tweet about nationally salient and polarizing figures and issues and are retweeted by the national media. But we may be worried that these overall results are masking variation within candidate and district features. And so to account for this, we estimate additional regressions of the same form as above on subsets of candidates by district competitiveness and by incumbency. These are the results for safe and competitive seat candidates. So again, of the same form as before, media type, topic, result by candidate type. And so the first thing I want to flag is, again, generally positive relationship here between being retweeted by the media and contributions received. The other thing I want to flag is when campaigns benefit more varies by their district competitiveness. So safe seat candidates get more money, similar to the overall results, when they tweet about nationally salient and polarizing things and are retweeted by the national news media. And in contrast, competitive seat candidates benefit more from attention by the local media and when they avoid nationally salient and polarizing figures, which are in these other categories. These are the results for incumbents and non-incumbents, again, of the same form. We still see general trends of a positive relationship between being retweeted by the media and contributions. And again, we see differences between incumbents and non-incumbents. Incumbents particularly benefit when they tweet about Republican leaders and are retweeted by the national media. Non-incumbents have a little bit more of a mixed story, but they can also benefit when they avoid these topics and are retweeted by the local media. So what do we find? One, we found evidence of a direct pathway. There's a positive and meaningful relationship between retweets and contributions received. Two, we found evidence of an indirect pathway and the role of the media. Specifically, we found that retweets by national media accounts are associated with more contributions, especially for safe seat candidates and incumbents when they engage with some of the most polarizing topics in American politics today. And secondly, retweets by local media accounts are associated with contributions for competitive seat candidates and non-incumbents, but especially when they avoid those topics. So what does this mean? We argue that this actually suggests that the media is still a gatekeeper for campaigns' ability to fundraise on Twitter. Yes, campaigns have control over what they say, but they have less control over the effect or the impact of their messages, especially on their ability to fundraise through their tweets. And given this, we argue that the incentives for campaigns to continue to engage with national topics and cater to individual donors nationwide is unlikely to decrease in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Our next presentation is going to be from Shannon McGregor. Shannon is an assistant professor at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media and a senior researcher with the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, both at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her research addresses the role of social media and their data and political processes with a focus on political communication, journalism, public opinion, and gender. She will present a working paper, Presidential Authority and the Legitimation of Far-Right News. Shannon, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just get my screen sharing set up here. Okay, awesome. So I'm presenting this paper that is co-authored also with Allison Archer, professor at the University of Houston, and Carolyn Schmidt and Hisu Jang, who are both graduate students at UNC. So we take as a starting point in this paper that there are changes in the media landscape, especially with hyper-partisan far-right news outlets such as Newsmax and OANN. Not only changes in their existence, but changes in the amount of people who are getting political news from these sites. And we want to try and understand what is the role of Republican members of Congress and the GOP in general in driving attention to these. In this study, I'll preview our findings, we find a dramatic increase in interviews from Republican members of Congress to far-right outlets, OANN, Newsmax, and also Breitbart during the Trump presidency. We also find an increase in coverage of these outlets in mainstream or legacy news media. And as an explanatory mechanism, we look at tweets like these. So this is from Donald Trump in 2020 after Pete Buttigieg appeared on Fox News. He's railing Trump, saying that this is why they have lost their ratings and many great alternatives are forming and exist. Try OANN and Newsmax, among others. This tweet exemplifies the core argument of our paper, which is examining how Trump used his authority as president to legitimize these far-right news outlets by sending authority signals like what we see in this tweet. So our overarching question asks, how did Trump use the power of the presidency to legitimate far-right news outlets, both within the Republican Party and in the broader media ecosystem? So briefly, where are we coming from theoretically? First, we assume that the president has both de jure authority as well as media-derived authority, given that he is covered by the media often. And we look at authority signals, which are either implicit or explicit signals that imply the legitimacy of individuals or ideas, such as how the president communicates and who he mentions in that communication. Part of understanding these authority signals from Trump is that he used this deeply populist communication style in which he positioned the mainstream media and elites as untrustworthy and instead promoted these far-right outlets as an alternative. These far-right outlets are hyper-partisan news sources that propagate extreme right-wing content. They don't follow mainstream media norms, and they're more loyal to politicians than mainstream media. In this case, we are looking at OANN, Newsmax, and Breitbart as 3 of these far-right outlets. So acceptance of authority is a key component of meaningful authority, or of being sort of rightful to power. And we operationalize this acceptance of authority through 2 variables. First, in mainstream media mentions of far-right news outlets, and second, in interviews given by Republican members of Congress to far-right outlets. And we argue that these forms of acceptance of Trump's authority signals suggest that he succeeded in legitimating these far-right outlets. So we expect that these authority signals that we find in Trump's tweets will be positively correlated with mainstream media coverage of far-right outlets, as well as Republican members of Congress appearances on far-right outlets. As our main independent variable, we take Trump's tweets. So we look at all of the tweets during his presidency, and we code them as to whether they were negative towards far-right outlets, positive towards far-right outlets, whether they announced an appearance of Trump or one of his surrogates on a far-right outlet, or whether he endorsed literally through a retweet or encouraged people to check out far-right outlets like we saw in the first tweet. As you can see, and you might imagine, we actually found no negative tweets about far-right outlets to exclude. And other work by my co-author, Allison Archer, finds that during this period where he over time started mentioning these far-right outlets more, he actually increasingly attacked Fox News as well. And so you can see in the little orange circles is the OANN, Newsmax is our little squares here, and Breitbart is our little green diamonds. We can see these increases over time, especially as we're getting towards the end of his presidency. So for our first dependent variable, we look at mainstream media news coverage, and this sort of draws on this institutional view of the press that the media select who and what is considered newsworthy. So in mentioning these far-right news outlets, they are considering them and communicating to their audiences that these are important and these are newsworthy. So we search ProQuest for online versions of these news outlets, searching for the names of these 3 far-right news outlets, OANN, Newsmax, and Breitbart. And so we find that there is increases in mentions of all of these outlets over time, most especially with OANN and with Newsmax. As you can see, Breitbart actually looks like it's getting less attention over time, but remember that it's getting a lot of attention here because Steve Bannon, who used to run Breitbart, was in the Trump White House during this time period. So when we excuse me, look at the initial sort of bivariate correlations, we uncover mostly positive and significant correlations between Trump's tweets about OANN and Newsmax and mentions of those outlets in mainstream news media. And then what I'm going to present to you here is also some more sophisticated models that we ran, which control for the temporal order of our causal argument. So we regress coverage of each far-right news outlet and each mainstream media outlet on Trump's tweets about the far-right outlet, lagged by 1 month. Because the lag-dependent variable is included as a control and fixed monthly effects are used, the coefficients for our key independent variables, Trump's tweets about these far-right news outlets, correspond to what is an average within-month change in the mainstream media's coverage of these far-right outlets. And so again, we find here relationships that are mostly positive. And in the case of Trump's tweets about Newsmax, statistically significant as well in terms of understanding what we have here and understanding this sort of argument about authority signaling. We see a negative relationship with Breitbart, which again, we think also is explained in some part because it has been around longer and because Bannon was in the White House in the beginning of our time period that we're looking at. Turning to our second dependent variable, we looked at Republican members of Congress who accepted these authority signals from President Trump we would find this in that they're increasingly granting interviews to far-right outlets, which again aids in the legitimizing of these outlets. In our data set, only 9 interviews were granted to OANN by Republican members of Congress in 2017, but that number rose to 23 in 2018, to 42 in 2019, and to 90 in 2020. For Newsmax, Republican legislators granted only 2 interviews in 2016, 5 in 2018, 8 in 2019, and 76 in, and 76 in 2020. We gathered these from these broadcast outlets using their YouTube channel, and we used the NELA GT database for these same sort of mentions in Breitbart, which, similar to the mainstream media mentions, don't show the same sort of upward trend in candidates, or in members of Congress granting interviews to them. And so here you can see those increases over time that I was mentioning. We find, again, positive and significant correlations between Trump's mentions of OANN and GOP members of the House and Senate appearances in those outlets. Similarly, House Republicans increasingly appeared on Newsmax in the months when Trump tweeted more about the channel. Republican senators, we don't see as much of movement in these areas. And in a similar lag model, which I'm happy to look at further if folks are interested later, or send it to you if you're interested, just to keep moving on in time, we find the same sort of positive direction with the House in OANN and Newsmax. So what does this all mean? We argue that through Trump's populist communication style, which denigrated mainstream media while elevating these far-right media outlets, his de jure and media-derived authority was transferred to these outlets. This not only further legitimates these far-right outlets, but to members of the Republican Party, but also in the eyes of the mainstream media. So these once fringe outlets, which were conferred with this newfound authority and legitimized in the political sphere, contribute to the mainstreaming of extremist viewpoints and of dangerous and anti-democratic notions like white supremacy. When news outlets choose to cover an organization or grant an interview to an individual, they also bestow some authority upon that source or organization as something worth knowing about. And so as the mainstream press amplifies these far-right outlets, this communicates that these outlets, especially Newsmax and OANN, are worth paying attention to. We also checked and looked at Google Trends data, which shows spikes in searches of these outlets, especially Newsmax and OANN, in the run-up to and in the months after the 2020 election. Our model suggests that we do find these positive relationships, as you can see. I think the impacts of this legitimation is manifold. Authority signaling by a former president to these far-right outlets transfers some authority to those outlets, and also exposes how these norms of presidential communication are really fragile. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks so much, Shannon. Our next and final presentation is going to be from Annelise Russell. Annelise is a research fellow at the Library of Congress, working on a project to detail the history and current trajectory of digital politics in Congress and what that means for congressional capacity, media relations, and political reputation making. She is also an assistant professor in the Martin School for Public Policy at the University of Kentucky, doing research on public policy within Congress with an emphasis on how new media platforms shape policymaking. She will present research from her latest book project, Tweeting Scared: Congressional Crisis Communication and Constrained Capacity.
All right, thank you so much. Let me get this pulled up. No. Let's see. Make sure. Let me start that over. Let's see. All righty. All right. So thanks so much for letting me talk about this. And I'm going to try to squish an entire book project into 10 minutes. So let's go. So this is a project that thinks about both what Maggie and Shannon just described, the effects of communication more broadly, and thinks about what digital means for how Congress and our political institutions operate. So why is it, this picture of Ted Cruz here, why is it that this behavior and this emphasis on digital has become a staple in Congress. And what does that mean? So the question that I ask here is, what happens when you take an advertising platform and use it for governance? And I think what I'm going to argue, and it's probably not a far shot, is nothing good. So this is a book project, as mentioned, about congressional capacity and what digital does to that. And sort of, I think about this in terms of crisis communication. And why do I do that? Because the argument here is that social media in Congress has hastened this race for information and creates this crisis of communication that both constrains institutional capacity and furthers power asymmetries. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means. But again, probably nothing good. So how do I do that? And the way I do that is talking to people who are in charge of that information exchange. So this project is powered by about 165 interviews at this point with communications and policy professionals in Congress that talk about the rise and threat of Twitter and the way in which it gets integrated into their daily routines and norms, and is part of the way that information moves in Congress. So today I'm going to talk about what that looks like and the implications of digital as a primary mechanism for information sharing within our political institutions. So the example that I'm going to start with, what does this look like, is starting with Representative Krishnamurthy, a very rank and file, probably a representative that many of you outside of Illinois have never heard of. But if you take a look at his Twitter profile for his official account, he's got an exceptionally high number of followers given his personal profile, right? So to give you some context here, he has more followers on his official side than either Representative Cori Bush or Majority Whip Steny Hoyer. And it's a high number of followers. And so why is this, right? What is going on here, right? And so if you haven't spent any time with Dear White staffers, I highly recommend it. But we get some insight into what is this strategy, right? And so they detail, right, that in this office, every weekday, his interns follow 1,000 people on Twitter, and then a bot unfollows non-verified accounts, right? And so he's strategically building up this clout and this Twitter following. Others, he's not the only one, others across the political spectrum have done this. And that extends to the way he also curates his Instagram followers, right? So you've got a political institution where the incentives are such to build up these digital communities, and offices are allocating resources to be able to do this, right? Why are they doing this? Well, a lot of this comes from the top down, right? So leadership is incentivizing this. So for the last 13 years, Steny Hoyer's office has had an annual summer competition where members of Congress are incentivized to gain as many new followers on social media as they can for an entire month. And there's a tracker that looks at how members of Congress have grown their digital portfolio. And so you see here at the bottom for this representative, out of the 200 plus members of the Democratic caucus, he ranks extremely high, again, across any number of platforms. And so you have a political institution that has recognized the role of digital and the role of social media and has incentivized and suggested to its members that it's important. But even outside of this, right, even outside of the strategic, specific digital impacts, how does this impact the way the institution operates on a daily basis? And so to give you an example of that, I turn to this very sort of basic statement that Senate Leader McConnell came out with, and this was in March of 2020. And I imagine, like myself, many of you have blocked out that period of time, but this is when the Senate was trying to decide what to do about the coronavirus very early on. And the Senate was originally supposed to be out of session. And the question is, we're going to have to do something, but when and what is that announcement coming? And typically, these announcements had gone through the Senate cloakroom. This has been a sort of very formulaic process about how people were notified. But in this instance, The first time anyone had heard about what the Senate was going to do, were they going to be in session, didn't come through the cloakroom. This came directly through Twitter. So administrative staff, offices often learned about what they were going to be doing to respond through Twitter or reporters who had been tweeting this. And it gives you, even when leadership is not saying directly, you need to be on Twitter, it gives you a sense of where they're beginning the information exchange and where they're putting their effort, even for things that are sort of fundamental to the daily operation of the institution. And you see that across any number of venues, right? We now have official Twitter statements. We have staff tweeting both professionally and personally. And what it leads to is this institution where digital becomes prioritized, but offices outside of leadership or those with resources don't have the capacity to actually meet that demand. And so the central framework for this project is that the communication crisis is the persistent crisis in Congress, right? And to a certain extent, Politico agrees with me, so I appreciate them for that huddle email. But instead of thinking about policy crisis, we should think about this in terms of the crisis of communication. And so what do I mean by a communication crisis? Because typically we think about this in the private sector. How do you respond to a disaster or a reputation threat? And so what I mean by that is sort of the fundamentals here are that the pace of information in Congress has increased, and there is an expectation of constant engagement such that they were always preparing and they're always engaging, they're always monitoring. And you're expected to do that today, again, with very few resources. Traditional crisis comms would suggest you go through multiple cycles and you eventually come to resolution or evaluation, and you see it through any sort of threat or crisis through that cycle. But in the very narrow crisis cycle of Twitter, background resolution and evaluation never occur, right? And so you get a certain type of rhetoric and you get a certain type of information that perpetuates this primary information flow. Also, to manage that information deluge, you get centralized hierarchical communication, again, both within offices, but more broadly within the institution, again, thinking about the role that leadership plays here. And finally, you're always prepared for viral disruption. And what do I mean by this? I liken it to weather, right? In the sense that meteorologists are always tracking and they're always monitoring the weather. They're always looking for severe weather, whether or not it's a tornado watch or a tornado warning. The crisis can vary, but you're always monitoring, and that requires resources and that requires time and effort. And so what happens when that time and effort grows? And what that ends up doing is fueling the power asymmetries that we often thought social media would disrupt, right? So that ends up meaning that party leaders provide resources to lawmakers in their offices to be able to engage in this digital game, right? You see Hoyer's office incentivizing lawmakers to be digital and to be online, but the resources to do that remain rather slim, and the only people with the resources to really do that on a effective and a professionalized basis are leaders. So they in turn end up offering what I term communication subsidy, that for a lot of offices, they end up having to rely on toolboxes, kits, training, and support that is often stemming from the party caucus or conference. You get a majority-minority conflict that gets perpetuated, very much like what Shannon detailed, in that the resources come from party leadership and party messaging. And when that occurs, you get more of that conflict and you get negativity and anger that is only increased over time. And the third thing is you get normalization rather than equalization. This notion that Twitter was going to level the playing field, that everyone could be AOC and could engage and successfully pursue that route, isn't really the reality in Congress, where 95% of members aren't capable of doing that and don't have the resources or the staff to be able to effectively pull that off. And so those with resources, those with money, and those with the capacity are able to utilize it based on the way that Congress is organized in ways that others can't. And so to give you a little bit of sense of how I go about this argument in the book, it's a mixed methods argument based on some House and Twitter data, sort of during the rise of social media during this time, taking place over both the Obama and Trump presidencies. And then again, this qualitative piece that looks at interviews with staff and journalists, probably the largest comms qualitative project that I know of in Congress that looks at how this has changed over time, what it looks like today, and what are the implications for how professionals do their job. I'm happy to talk more about that process if people are curious. But sort of to wrap up and give you a sense of sort of where this project is going, I'm here in DC at the Library of Congress, so finishing up interviews with folks and then cleaning my poor research assistants, cleaning hours of interview transcripts that allow us to continue building out some of these themes from the data. And instead of find the book, well, I guess it's a perpetual find, but finishing the book. So I look forward to any questions or comments that you have. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Annelise. So we're going to turn over to Q&A. I'm going to ask the first question to each of them, sort of roundtable style, and then we'll move to the Q&A box. So I'll just quickly ask the questions first. So for Maggie, so you sort of focused on heterogeneous effects, specifically between incumbent and non-incumbent, national media, and sort of local media. I have sort of two other questions around what you might expect heterogeneous effects to be. The first is across platforms. So how is Twitter different or not from something like Facebook or TikTok? And also across election periods, right? If I remember your regression tables correctly, you know, the largest effect on contributions was incumbents being retweeted by national media talking about Republicans, which one could read as a bit of a Trump effect here. And so I'm wondering whether you sort of expect differences across election cycles. This is the next question for Shannon is sort of this question around like a process of legitimization, right? So like, you know, there was, you looked at this sort of temporally across time, how this changed. Obviously, Trump is no longer in office. So have these sort of far right news organizations been made legitimate? Or is it a process that's actually going to require further legitimization? And if it's the latter, what have you seen sort of in the last 2 years since Biden took over? And then my final question, sort of for Annelise, is a question about the nature of these communications crises, right? A lot of times when we use the word crisis, we think of something that's sort of objective. COVID-19 was a public health crisis because people were going to die. Inflation is sort of an economic and social crisis because food is being made more expensive. Here, are these real sort of crises that they actually need to respond to? Or is there a manufactured sort of dynamic to them? And would love to hear sort of the way that congressional staffers were thinking about that. So you can, to give everyone time to think about it, we can go in order, Maggie, Shannon, and then Annelise.
Yeah, thank you for that, Z. That's a really good question. So taking the first difference first, platforms, I think you're definitely right. So I think one way in this would vary is we know or suspect that other platforms, so an Instagram, a Facebook, a TikTok is probably reaching regular people in and outside of the district. So I would expect the like direct pathway of being able to elicit money straight from those people would be higher or as high on other platforms. But Twitter is more of a space where elites exist and very explicitly watch campaigns. So I don't think the media effect would spread. I will say Shannon's presentation got me wondering about like alt platforms for Republican or like alt-right media. They might be on like Tumblr or not Tumblr, that's the wrong one, Telegram or Gab or something. So that's something that I will think more about. And secondly, in terms of your election period, I do suspect that a lot of this is a Trump effect. So something that I haven't done is split this between primary and general election periods. But I think even for both, I think there was a lot of just like either anti-Trump or pro-Trump rhetoric all throughout the 2020 campaign cycle. But I think you're definitely right that there could be differences over time, and in other elections, other topics or figures might rise to prominence.
Great, thanks, Shannon.
All right, so I think it's a really interesting question, and I think that we do see further evidence of this legitimation sort of continuing, that it's not just a Trump period effect. because in the run up to the midterms that we're, about to have right now, scores of Republican candidates, including newcomers who usually need media attention, are actually not giving any media interviews at all, except to these far right outlets. They're not talking to local press. They're not talking to national press, even in big, like nationally sort of important campaigns, for example, like the Pennsylvania governor. And so I think that provides some evidence that this is like not just a sort of momentary thing. And I think that's really problematic, right? Because then when these Republican candidates limit their access to just these far right outlets, not only does that mean that like fewer news outlets can provide any sort of like scrutiny, right, or even attention to these other candidates, but it also means that furthers the legitimation cycle, at least within the GOP, but also then to GOP voters, right? Sort of coming outside of the elite circle, I suspect that we looked at just in this paper. And I just did a quick Google Trend search after you asked me the question. And while there is still an ongoing sort of trend of people searching for OANN and Newsmax, not rising to the levels as it did right around January 6th, but it doesn't seem to be really strongly decreasing, which I think provides a little bit of evidence that this is something that's sort of continuing to unfold.
One quick follow-up question before we move to Annelise is like, what do you think the reason is for what you're sort of observing with candidates during the 2022 midterms, right? Because when you think of sort of strategic actors or politicians who want to be elected, you would expect them to try to reach a wide sort of set of the electorate. Here, I mean, in what you cited, it's only roughly 10% of people view these sort of far right platforms. And so do you think that it's signaling? Do you think that there's some other way that we should think of this comm strategy? Because it sort of strikes me as bizarre coming out of some of the political science literature around how to engage in campaign communications.
Yeah, no, I think it's really bizarre. But I think so much of it is tied up in this like populist communication style that obviously has been very successful, right, for candidates not only on the right, but in particular on the right, which is, signaling that the mainstream or local media or whatever is the enemy, and these are the only ones that can be trusted, are these other outlets. But we also see that candidates, I mean, to both Maggie and Annelise's presentation, that candidates are using these other outlets. So like, for example, the governor race that I was mentioning, Doug Mastriano, like won't give interviews to anybody, but he does these like long Facebook lives. So in addition to giving interviews like to these far right news outlets, they're leveraging their social media in different ways, which are leading, as Maggie shows, to contributions and likely to, attention outside of these mainstream cycles as well.
Great, thanks. Annelise, both the question I asked and then I saw that you sort of typed an answer to the question in chat, but would love to give you space to answer that live as well.
Yeah, so when it comes to thinking about the nature of a comms crisis, so I think this occurs, we should think about this in two ways. One, a communication crisis in the sense of how they respond. And so I think it's about less the issue and the way that they perceive the threat, right? So it's very much based on their perception and sort of the need to always be on, the need to be always responding. And so that behavior, whether or not there's an actual crisis or not, like we've heard this from comms in the sense of we can talk about it, we can think about it as event driven or sort of this pseudo crisis, right? And sort of we can debate sort of the strength of the crisis or whether or not there actually is a crisis. Is it a crisis if it's only 3 hours and it burns fast? But I would argue the preparation is such that it mimics that of a crisis. And the other way to think about it is not just this crisis communication, but a crisis of communications, right? And thinking about the sustainability of the institution and how information moves. And if information moves through that institution primarily on an advertising platform, what does that mean for the capacity of the institution to function and its own questions about sort of what gets prioritized and what gets incentivized? The other thing from the chat that I was responding to was thinking about the motivation and sort of why they're seeking this constant engagement and sort of, is it electorally motivated? Is it public opinion motivated? Is it to keep up with other members? And you have to keep in mind that for governance Twitter and sort of official counts, Twitter is very much a inside the beltway game. It's for those who are very engaged. It's for other members. It's for journalists. If you ask most staffers who is their audience, they say it's journalists. Now, journalists can take on, the spectrum, as Shannon talked about, sort of that variance is increasing in who they're really speaking to. But it's not a public, it's not a constituent facing platform. That gets to the sort of the question that Maggie addressed about differences across platforms, right? If you want a constituent based medium, like Shannon said, you're going to go to Facebook, you're going to do a long Facebook Live, you're not going to go to Twitter. There are members of Congress who are like, they may have a Twitter account, but they're not going to advertise it, particularly on the Republican side, because that's not their audience, or that's not who they perceive their audience to be. And so you've got a lot more nuance sort of in who that audience is, particularly when you're talking about in governance versus the campaign.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to turn things over to Josh for a sec, one of our two faculty co-directors, because I think he has a question for both Shannon and Annelise.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks so much to both of you. This has been, and to all three of you, this has been a fascinating seminar, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time to share your research with us today. Let me go back to Shannon first. And my question is, I'm trying to think of this, of the issue about where, if you're a Republican congressperson, where are you going to go on media from a budget constraint perspective? So I guess my question is sort of like, is the preference for OAN and all of these sort of far right-wing, media, more far-right media outlets in addition to Fox, or is it instead of going on Fox? And the Mastriano thing, I have to admit, is like totally fascinating to me, but let's like bracket him for just a second, because this seems to be like something different entirely. But if you think of it from a budget constraint perspective, if you only have so much time to go on TV, it's sort of puzzling that people would go on TV where they know they're going to get a smaller audience. So I was trying to think through why they might do that. One might be that they think that smaller audience is just much more important, right? That OAN viewers are more likely to be primary voters than Fox viewers are. So I'd be curious whether you think that's the case. The other, but I'm not sure about that, because we've spent the last 10 years saying they only go on Fox because Fox viewers are the most important people for primaries and stuff like that. So then the question that it seems to beg is whether it's only an audience of one that matters. Like, have we hit the point where Trump's endorsement in these Republican primaries, or preventing Trump from endorsing a challenger, is so important that everything else pales by comparison? Or do I have the framework wrong? Is it like, this is just, people that members of Congress they don't have a fixed constraint on how much time they spend on media. The constraint is that how often, for most of them, how often they get invited, and they'll go on whenever they get invited. And so I'm framing the problem wrong. So any comments on any of that would be totally appreciated.
No, thank you. I think it's both, right? So I think that, actually, I think it's all three of the things that you've heard. So I do think that, like, we would suspect, like I recently did in another study, an examination of people who say that these far-right news outlets are one of their top 3 news sources. And these people are, similar to what Andy Guest finds, and with all partisan media, more likely to participate in politics, more interested in politics, right? So there's the sort of primary voter, likely voter effect going on for sure. I also very much think it's an audience of one. And I think we're going to have a test of whether, I think we saw pretty good evidence that the Trump endorsement meant something in the primary period. I think there's a greater question about what that's going to look like, in the general election. So I think this will be a really interesting thing to sort of track. But I also think it is not just about invites. I think it's also about extremity and position. So I literally just this morning was writing some other descriptives on this project so that we can get it out for publication, and looking at who appeared most often, and also cross-referencing that with positions of leadership within Congress. So Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy are in the, appearing not a ton, Kevin McCarthy more than Mitch McConnell, but appearing pretty often in all of these, because that makes sense. Their leadership, they're going to appear probably everywhere more often, right? But when we look at the members of Congress who appear just most often overall on these far-right news outlets, it's the furthest extreme to the right. It's Matt Gaetz, it's Rand Paul, it's Jim Jordan, it's Steve Scalise, Marsha Blackburn. And so I think we also see a like partisan extremity thing just even within the GOP going on as well. Because I will say there are, you know, tons of members of Congress from the GOP who never appeared on any of these outlets.
Great, thanks so much. And Annelise, I have a question for you, and we have a question for Maggie as well. So if I can ask you to keep, since we only have about 6-7 minutes left, to keep the answer to like 3 minutes, that would be awesome. So my question to you, I found your presentation fascinating with this question about social media not as a leveler, right? Like I found it a very intriguing argument. And so my question for you is whether or not your findings or your conclusion about what this has done to communication strategies extends to campaigns. Because I found myself a lot in pushing back on reporters who are saying, oh, a ban on political advertising on Twitter, wouldn't that be great for American democracy? And saying, well, one thing we know about advertising on social media is that it's much cheaper. And we know that incumbents have more money than challengers do. And so if we shut off cheaper forms of advertising, it's going to benefit incumbents. So my question for you is, like, does your argument, are we missing something here? Does your argument extend to campaigns? Is it also not a leveler in campaigns, and do we have this kind of framework wrong, or is there a distinction between campaigns and governing that is different here? And in governing, it's, you know, greater returns to those with higher resources, but in campaigns, it's still that social is helping, you know, especially vis-a-vis TV, right, is going to help challengers more than incumbents.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I think to a certain extent, that's right, that there is a sort of a normalization effect regardless. The interesting thing is the big difference between governance and campaigns, right, is this distinction between paid and earned media, right, which you don't have for governance, right? And that in and of itself, I think puts together a separate set of constraints that will affect campaigns in ways that it doesn't affect governance. However, sort of the blending of sort of campaigns and governance and sort of thinking about them distinctly is hard, because if you think about this from a staff level, sort of like we're currently in this position where there are a lot of digital and comm staffers who are either officially or unofficially putting in a lot of campaign work. And a lot of the digital capacity in Congress exists outside the institution, right? So to be a policymaker, to be a policy staffer, to be a traditional comm staffer, you can develop those skills and that capacity within the institution. For digital, most of that is done outside the institution, and a lot of that is done on the campaign, right? We saw that in terms of Ossoff and TikTok in the 2020 election, and we'll see that again. You know, will the Fetterman style get translated into governance? And my argument is probably yes, because everyone's like, "Ooh, that's shiny and new. Will it work for us?" Now, I would say probably not, but there is this interesting dynamic where you see what works for a campaign sort of try to get utilized in governance. And so I think there's reason to expect that we would see similar constraints and similar incentives across governance and campaign, simply because the people who are doing digital in Congress, a lot of them come from that campaign environment, and those are the norms, and they understand what works in that space. And there's an expectation that, well, it should work in governance. And sort of, I think there are ways in which that maybe the normalization doesn't get realized quite as much, but in the way that Congress is set up today, I think it's we have reason to expect that sort of this notion of normalization exists both inside and outside, but I would guesstimate that the effects of it are a little bit stronger within the chamber, just given that you don't have the paid versus earned media dichotomy that you do on the campaign side.
Great, thanks so much. So one final question for Maggie, which is that your research suggests that there's sort of strong incentives for candidates to go viral. And the way that it sort of looked at it in the context of your research was sort of text and then traditional media, right? The mediating effect of traditional media on sort of text-based communications on social media. I was wondering what your sort of expectations are, whether you've thought about studying sort of two different sort of ways along both axes. The first is like different mediums, memes, videos, etc., and then also different forms of like mediating forces, more specifically like alternative influencers with big followings.
Yes, those are good questions. So to your first point, Yes, I have thought about other mediums. So there's a project that I think a group of us at CSMAP are going to be starting soon, looking at memes. So again, thinking specifically about the Fetterman campaign of like, what does it mean when you're shit posting and you're going viral? And like, that's not policy, it's something else. And it can be an effective strategy to get attention. We just don't know yet if it's an effective fundraising tool. So yes, so then bringing in like pictures and videos, etc. And in terms of the other mediating forces, you're definitely right. So I think on Twitter, I would still expect this to be the case for other political elites. So in my own work from my dissertation, which is now a book project, I found that interest groups are actually a really important audience for campaigns. For incumbents and non-incumbents, they give more money when the politicians signal that they're interested or proficient in their area. It could also be the case that celebrities, if Taylor Swift tweets about you, what happens? So those are all things that we've been thinking about as well.
Great, thank you so much. So we're just at time. So I want to give sort of 3 thanks before we end. The first is to the 3 presenters for sharing your fantastic research. The second is for everyone who joined us today. And the third is for Eric Upsall, our Director of Communications, for actually sort of organizing and executing this. As a reminder, please join us for our next seminar next Wednesday at the same time. We'll have Kevin Munger, a former NYU PhD student and current CSMAP faculty affiliate, who's now assistant professor at Penn State. He'll be giving a talk about his new book, Generation Gap: Why the Baby Boomers Still Dominate American Politics and Culture. So thank you again, and everyone, I hope you have a lovely Wednesday.
Thank you.